Fun. So I'm originally in Boston this week, mostly to talk about power systems at different events. Today is sort of a side tour from power systems where I talk about methods. So don't expect that, but there will be some power system applications in the end. Good. Quick acknowledgements. This work has really been driven by my postdoc, Florian Dörfler, with different collaborators from, I guess, 3 countries, which you can recognize by the flags, China, Italy, and Sweden. So that's the team that has been behind that. Okay, I'd like to kick things off with some perspectives on data-driven control. And I know this is a topic that everybody has an opinion on, so please take this as my personal opinion and reading of the literature. First, we should acknowledge there has been a rich and vast history. I think we can trace it back at least to Carl Ostrom and Haglund in the 70s when they developed auto-tuned PID controls, of which now tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands are out in the field tuning PID responses on the fly. The development of literature has been fragmented between different fields, systematification, for instance, but what I want to highlight now are the 2 ones, namely reinforcement learning, which is sort of the newer kids in the block, and more classic adaptive control. There have been, of course, various people that try to build bridges. Here's a very famous article by Barton and Sutton, that invented Q-learning, that already recognized back in the day that reinforcement learning is a particular variation of adaptive control. And I guess also here from MIT, there are statements about bridging the gap between the 2. Okay, but these have been sort of developing in parallel in the last decade. There has been a common root to many of these approaches, which is dynamic programming. Okay, you can trace back approach from both fields coming from dynamic programming. There have been attempts, to bridge ideas from approximate and neurodynamic programming, also developed here at MIT, over to adaptive control, under the name of adaptive dynamic programming. That was around 2008, 2010, mostly spearheaded by Frank Lewis. But that literature somewhat never took off and faded away, this crossing between adaptive control and dynamic programming or reinforcement learning. I will later on comment why not. I think the main reasons why this bridge has never been crossed is mostly cultural gaps. At least that's my reading of the literature from both fields. They just are going after different goals. So when I give a seminar in an adaptive control workshop, they really care about stabilization. In fact, most people work in adaptive control, come out of nonlinear control, and they phrase every problem as, let's minimize an error coordinate, let's drive it to 0. So it's really a stabilization problem. Whereas people in reinforcement learning think about problems in the spirit of online optimization. Everything is an online optimization problem. And these 2, of course, clash with these 2 perspectives. Another one is, how do you deal with uncertainty? Of course, control people say, you have to be robust, so you solve a min-max problem. Whereas in the reinforcement learning, they would embrace this optimism in the face of uncertainty, so you solve a min-min problem. Also a bit difference in culture. Do you embrace pen and paper, or do you embrace compute? And what are you after? Are you after theory certificates, or are you after impressive demos? That's just some cultural gaps why these 2 don't really find together. So I'll make another attempt to see if we can bridge the gap and hope we can a little bit cross-fertilize ideas from both cultures. But I think it's mostly cultural reasons why these, despite many attempts over multiple decades, have not found together these 2 communities. Okay, so the title of the talk is about data-driven pipelines. So let me review, I think, 4 different classifications of how you can set up a pipeline for these adaptive control problems. One distinction is the one of direct versus indirect, which is very classical and old. Essentially, the picture is the following. You are the control designer, you're the brain. You interface yourself to a black box, and you ask, what should you do? Should you build a model out of the black box from the data, a mechanistic model, do a SysID plus uncertainty quantification, and do model-based design? That's the indirect approach. Or should you just search for a control policy compatible with the data you've seen, which nowadays people use mostly data informativity and behavioral methods to do that. So those are 2 different views to arrive at the goal. 2 other ways to classify the pipelines is more like, how do you run the algorithms? Are the algorithms offline or are they online? And what I realized, depending on who you talk to, everybody has a different understanding of what means online. So one is sort of episodic offline algorithms. That is, you collect your data in batches, you decide on your control policy, you put it in a system, you roll out trajectories, you get new data, and you repeat multiple times, possibly. Whereas what people typically understand adaptive control is if the algorithm itself is a feedback loop that is recursive. That is, you measure what you get from the system, you adapt your policy, you act, and you repeat. So the algorithm itself is a feedback loop that is non-episodic. And that's what I mean by online, so recursive and with closed-loop real-time data. There have been many well-documented trade-offs on all of these aspects. You can read papers and books back to the 80s where people argue what is better, direct or indirect. And they're well understood by now. So questions are, what are you after? Are you after robust stability or are you after optimality? Do you care about a modular pipeline they can easily debug, or do you care about an end-to-end approach? I mean, all of these have merits depending on the problem that you look at. And they have different complexity estimates from what you care about, like sample complexity, how much compute you use, how tractable it is. And people have been arguing about these points over multiple decades. I think the gold standard, if you could achieve it, I mean, that gold standard means probably you cannot achieve it, is if you had a pipeline that was adaptive, that could adapt in real time, that is optimal, ideally, at the same time robust, cheap, simple computations, and ideally direct. A reason being people recognize that the uncertainty propagation from data to the model to the policy is too hard, or you have to do it very conservatively. So if you can go directly after the policy, maybe that's what you should do. Okay. So we've been studying this from many perspectives for many years, and thrown all sorts of fancy tools at this problem and demos and whatsoever. But today I don't want to talk about something fancy, so there will be no deep learning or impressive robot demos. I just want to discuss a very basic problem, and maybe the only problem where we clearly understand what's going on, which is probably the most classic problem in both fields. It's sort of the benchmark from all of these communities, which is the LQR problem. Okay? That is, you have a linear system in discrete time, x plus ax plus bu, driven by disturbance w. You close the loop with a linear policy, u is kx. The performance output you care about, the set, is so that when you square it, so set squared would be the familiar x transpose qx plus u transpose ru. And if you cannot say anything about this problem, then all other problems are essentially hopeless. But for this problem, you can more or less understand the pros and cons of the different approaches. So here's one way to pose the LQR problem. You want to minimize the expected value of the long-term average cost of x transpose qx, u transpose ru, expectation of a disturbance, subject to the linear dynamics and subject to the linear policy. That's one out of many ways how you can write down this problem. And people from all these communities, of course, attack this problem. So almost all these variations of direct, indirect, offline, episodic, adaptive have more or less been explored over the multiple decades. I was actually not interested in the problem. I was working out a tutorial paper or a tutorial for my class, but then I realized even this problem has some open gaps and it's actually quite interesting. So here are two gaps that identified that despite multiple decades, people have not looked at them. I don't think they didn't look at them because the problems were too hard. It's just they didn't care about them. For instance, it turns out there has never been any sort of direct adaptive control attempt on the LQR problem. Surprisingly, right? When I talk to the people in adaptive control, the old-timers, they would tell me, well, first of all, we'd never cared about optimality. And the ones that tried to solve it, they didn't find the error coordinates to stabilize. So it's essentially a little bit of a cultural mismatch. Also, when you look into the literature of adaptive dynamic programming that tried to bring these ideas from approximate dynamic program to adaptive control, none of these many papers have been written ever talked about the closed loop. It's all about algorithmic conversions. Some policy iteration will converge, some value iteration will converge to algorithmic convergence, but it's not clear what happens in closed loop. That's a question I've been sidestepping. And I talked to some of the people that have been writing these papers in the late 2000s. And again, they said, well, there was sort of a mismatch again in the community. The control community didn't care about all these, fancy approximation of neural networks, and that's why they published elsewhere. And these other people didn't care about stability, and that's why they didn't look at it. Just some anecdotes that I heard from people that were working on these problems back in the time. But of course, curious if you had other anecdotes why people have not looked into these problems. So today, I want to revisit these problems, so really old problems, classical problems, but bring in some new perspective. One of the new perspectives we bring in, it's actually an old perspective that has been rediscovered about 5 years ago, is behavioral system theory. So behavioral system theory is invented by Jan Willems, a Dutch mathematical system theorist, who said, let's not look at dynamic systems as what if input-output maps, state space, transfer functions, whatsoever. He said, a system is just a set of trajectories, and we work with a pure set theoretic definition. For instance, a linear system would be in the space of all time series, it would span a subspace. it's time invariant, the subspace has some shift invariance properties. And he said, let's only work with this definition. A linear system is a subspace in the space of trajectories. And how you characterize subspace with models or with data is up to you. We will leverage a particular parameterization that has recently gotten some attention, among others by a plenary talk by probably no others, which is sample covariance. So you build empirical covariance matrices to parameterize the subspace of trajectories. And that's sort of the model in quotation marks that you work with. And the other thing we bring in, which is seemingly obvious to, I guess, the new generation, like you get new data points, what you do, where you go down the gradient, which I guess what most people would do nowadays. It turns out this idea was maybe outrageous in the adaptive control community because they did not consider that necessarily. So we'll look into policy gradient methods, one of the working horses of reinforcement learning. So you get a new data point, you update your policy by going down the gradient of this LQR type cost function, which has some challenges, non-convexity and so on, but these have by now been mostly handled. And so we bring these two different tools together and see if we can from that build an online adaptive control pipeline. Okay, so here are the contents for the remainder of the talk, the menu. So I'll talk about these learning pipelines. First, only talk about algorithmic properties, algorithmic convergence. When would a gradient descent on certain coordinates with some normalization or so converge? And then I'll also talk about the closed loop properties. Will this actually work in closed loop or not? Actually, the answer is not necessarily. You have to adapt it a little bit. And I brought some case studies from robotics, flight and power systems. Let's see if we can cover them. Good. So let's go into the problem setup. It's very simple. It's literally what you could teach in a bachelor control course, but that makes it, I guess, quite appealing because it turns out to be not trivial. Here's again the LQR problem, linear control policy around a linear system. That's how I wrote it before. So you minimize over the policy K, the expected long-term average periodic cost. This is not how you solve the problem. I mean, you could try to solve it this way, but people normally reformulate this problem differently, so it's easier to solve. One reformulation that gained a lot of traction, I think, I forgot when, probably in the 90s, is when people discovered, we can attack this problem through Riccati and LMI equations. So we formulate this normally in terms of what is called the controllability grammian. So we write this in terms of x times x transposed, if you want, so that's a state covariance matrix, and parameterize the problem in terms of that state covariance matrix. Let's call this one sigma. And then the cost function of x transpose qx would be the trace of q sigma, the trace of k r sigma k. And then as a constraint, you just have your Lyapunov equation, which is sort of the steady state covariance equation, which you can solve for sigma. As you know, there's a unique positive definite solution to that equation. So then that's much more a nice way to write this. You can easily convexify it, put it into your semi-definite solver, and get a solution. So you can solve this with STPs. You can use contraction of Riccati equation or first order methods, policy evaluation improvement. There's many approaches people have developed over the years how to solve that, obviously. And we all teach this in our courses, so I don't tell you anything new. So let me take a look at a sort of data parameterization of that problem, which again is very obvious, but people have only really rediscovered this about maybe 5 years ago. So let's assume we have data from our system. Let's assume we have a matrix x0 that contains the entire time series of x from x0, x1 until xt minus 1. That's our state data. Let's say we also have a successor data, so that's just everything shifted by +1. So x1 is time series from x1 to xt. We have the input time series. In a ideal world, you'd also have the disturbance time series W0. And all these matrices have to satisfy the model equations because they come from that model. Now, of course, what makes the problem interesting is you don't know the W time series, right? You don't know the disturbance. And you need to assume to solve that problem, actually, the necessary condition for solving the LQR is an identifiability condition. So you have persistive excitation, that is your data matrix of state and input pairs has full rank, which is sort of also the condition under which you could solve a least square problem. Okay, so it's just a reformulation. And now let me tell you the, vanilla approach to solving this. It's what is called the indirect approach, indirect certain equivalence approach. So use your data and first solve a least square problem in an inner loop. So it's formulated as a bi-level optimization problem. So the inner loop is figure out A and B by solving the least square problem, so minimizing the residual of your data equation. You take this estimate, and with the estimate, you go into the model-based design. You don't robustify things, you just take this certain equivalent formulation. Quite plain, just abstract now as a bi-level optimization problem. Now you can do this, of course. You can write down all sorts of theorems about that, but I don't want to go there. I find this entire approach to data-driven control a little bit lame, just like I would say 99% of all others, for the simple reason it's not very sporty. You do this all offline, right? I mean, the real problem is, could you solve this actually online? You know, can you not separate offline learning, online control, but do it in one shot? Okay. Why? Because you'd like to improve, of course, on your policy online and adapt rapidly to any sort of disturbance or time-varying nature of the equations. So the question is, can you solve this in an adaptive fashion? And you know, another fun fact I discovered about adaptive control is you talk to any sort of so-called expert on adaptive control and ask them, what is adaptive control? And you'll get, you know, for everyone, you get a different definition. And then it turns out actually there is no definition everybody agrees on, respectively, there is no definition whatsoever. The only definition I found, really, that has been written down is one by Sames. So Sames was not an adaptive control person, he was actually in the opposite camp. And when I talked to, again, people from before my generation, they said they were really fighting each other. The adaptive control people did not like Sames at all. But he wrote down a very nice definition in one of his last papers before I think he passed away half a year later. And he defined adaptive control by two monotonicity principles. One is you have to interact with a system and information increases. And the other one is, of course, also control performance should increase. So you want to improve upon the best offline control that you construct with a priori information. I gave a similar talk in the IFAC adaptive control workshop. And they essentially kicked me out of the room when I showed the Sames picture. They did not like him at all. They would say, no, I mean, adaptive control is about stabilization in face of uncertain parameters. It has nothing to do with that. So I guess, you know, there are camps in there. I don't have an opinion on that. I just want to say many people would not say this is a proper definition. But let's run with that, because that's very much in the spirit of reinforcement learning. And our desired solution would be, we want to have an adaptive solution, so that should work in real time with closed loop data, non-episodic, non-batch, and ideally have a recursive implementation. And then we'll see if we go indirect or direct and what the merits are. And our idea how to find this adaptive solution is very, very, very naive, as we just go down the gradient and see if that works. So here would be the block diagram. So we close the loop with a linear control policy. And what we do is simultaneously, we do a gradient descent in policy space. That is, at any point in time, I collect my data, and then I do a gradient step going down the cost function of the LQR problem, which I would think nowadays, from a more modern perspective, is the most naive thing you could do, and you wonder why did people not do this a long time ago? And I think the reason was just, again, cultural grabs. They didn't care about it. So it seems obvious. What is not so obvious is, you know, will this work? So on the algorithmic side, will this converge? How do you compute the gradient, actually? How do you compute it efficiently? Do you go direct or indirect? And in closed loop, do you have stability? Do you get robustness or not? Let me just tell you why it's not obvious to get stability. Even if at any point in time your policy is stabilizing, at any point in time the closed loop system is different, right? So you have a sequence of stable matrices, but it has zero implication about the entire sequence being stable. So it's not obvious that this would actually work in closed loop. So let's just try it out before I give you a little bit of the background. So here's an example where we put it on a little toy system with some collaborators. So we have an autonomous bike that we want to stabilize, drive along. It turns out if you just do LQR on that bike, it won't work. The bike is a nonlinear system, it would just fall down, non-minimum phase, plenty of issues. So what we did here is, so we put around a small feedback linearization controller for a small bicycle model, like it's just a 2D model. We cancel out the main linearity. That wouldn't work by itself, but then we strapped around a linear system, this sort of adaptive LQR, where we go down the gradient policy space and see if that works. So the outer loop is this adaptive LQR. So let's see if that video is running. Yeah. So what maybe we should look at is the sort of on the side, you see here the control gains, and they're nicely converging after some iteration, and we could actually now stabilize the bicycle and drive along. So this naive idea of just online, let's go down the gradient, apparently works. And for this example, you could stabilize the system. It turns out if you make the control a little more aggressive, it will not work. It will break apart. So we have to understand a little bit why and when it works. Okay. So let's go into different learning pipelines. So here are the ones we have explored. And that's a big tree of different directions you could take. Do you go model-based or do you go model-free? And then you go down the gradient. Do you modify the gradient with some Fisher information or some Newton metric or robustify it? There's a lot of variations you could take in the problem. Let me just do the most simple thing first, and we talked then about maybe different paths. The most simple one is the indirect path, that is, use data to online identify a model, and then with the identified model, you go down the gradient. And if you understand that, the others are also more simple to grasp. Okay. So a problem that has received a lot of attention ever since 2019, when Mariam Fossel sort of wrote a quite similar paper on that, is the LQR optimization landscape. So let me introduce the main ingredients here. So we have an LQR problem. We can actually uniquely resolve the constraint equation. It's a Lyapunov equation. You know, the solution of the Lyapunov equation is a plus b k to the power k squared and summed of all time. It's the Gramian, right? So we know the explicit solution. So we can just think about this problem as a function of k. So here's what this looks like for a simple example, like a two-dimensional system problem. You see this cost function actually looks quite nice. Convex level set seems like, yeah, gradient descent should work in general. It turns out this is a nice example. I can also construct the two-dimensional examples where actually it's not convex and it's not obvious what would happen. So J of k is usually not convex, but it is differentiable. And you can actually write down the explicit gradient. It's a formula above me. To compute it, you would have to solve two Lyapunov equations, the closed-loop controllability Gramian and the closed-loop observability Gramian. The fact that it's differentiable and we can compute the gradient, and this is what the gradient looks like, was actually known since the late 70s. Actually, a paper from MIT, I think correctly. Who was it? Mike Athens, who was here, right? So already in the 70s, people worked out the gradient formulas and figured out it's differentiable. So it's nothing new per se. But one thing that surprisingly took 4 or 5 decades is for somebody to prove that this would converge. And again, I don't think because the proof is very hard. It's probably because nobody cared about it. Because we had LMIs, SDP solvers, so who cared about first-order methods to solve that problem? So it was in about 2019, I think, when Mariam Fossel, Miriam Esbahi, and a postdoc of them worked out that this gradient descent would actually converge. So they worked out this LQR cost function. It's not convex, but it's cursive, that it has compact level sets. It would blow up when you have unstabilizing gains. It's smooth, meaning the derivative is actually Lipschitz continuous. So you can actually formally show the Hessian is bounded. And it has a property what's called gradient dominance. That is, you could upper bound the cost function J of k by the optimizer plus a constant times the gradient squared. And these 3 ingredients together would tell you if you initialize yourself at a stabilizing policy, you converge. So that took from the 1970s until today, until somebody showed that. But again, I think it's just because nobody cared about it. So the formal result is the following. So we think about this J of k, the LQR cost. And then, there's a few people that worked on that. There's a nice survey paper from Lina, Tamer, and others that shows, yes, if you do gradient descent on the LQR cost, and if initially stabilizing policy, then gradient descent will actually converge with a linear rate to the optimum. Okay, so we know gradient descent would work. And that's sort of one way how you could now possibly build an adaptive pipeline. Namely, you collect your data, you collect your matrices of the x0 time series, the x1 time series, everything shifted by +1, the input time series. You update your model, so you do, for instance, a recursive least square step or a mean least square step. And then you compute the 2 Gramians, and then you just do the gradient descent. And you repeat. Okay, so this is one thing you could do. And that actually, at least the algorithm would converge. But it's not clear if the closed loop converges. So that's sort of the vanilla idea how to approach it. It turns out maybe that's not the best way to do. So people develop different results. One is what became known as the Heuer algorithm. Essentially, that's going down the gradient in the Hessian metric. Okay, so you don't go down just the gradient, you pre-multiply it by the inverse Hessian or an approximation thereof. So you would pre-multiply the gradient by some matrix M of k that approximates the Hessian matrix. And if you go down in the Hessian direction, you get a much quicker path to convergence because you're not always, just like gradient descent is orthogonal to the level sets, whereas if you go down the Hessian direction, you take a straight path, at least for a quadratic objective. So again, people worked out many variations of that and proofs, but it turns out this Heuer's algorithm, which is iterative policy evaluation and policy improvement, would actually be the same as an approximate descent in the Newton direction. Another pre-multiplier you could take is an inverse Fisher information matrix. That picture, it is not necessarily going down the gradient inverse fish information matrix, but nice to illustrate what's going on. If you just follow the gradient, it may take a very long path to your objective. Maybe you should also bias the gradient in the direction where you have the largest variance. And that's why you multiply it with something like the inverse fish information matrix to explore, essentially go where variance is large. It turns out for the LQR problem, you don't actually have to compute any fish information. You can just post-multiply the gradient by the inverse covariance, okay, by the inverse solution sigma of your Lyapunov equation. And that's very easy to evaluate. It turns out actually if you want to evaluate that gradient, you just compute one Lyapunov equation. So it's very efficient and simple. So there's maybe better ways than just pure gradient descent. But this is all indirect. And so the question that we've been asking is, can you also do this direct? Can you compute the gradient without first identifying a model? And if so, what are the benefits of possibly doing that? Okay. And that's where we use this behavioral system theory and covariance parameterization. So let me first tell you why. I mean, why do you want to go indirect? It turns out for two reasons, indirect is often preferred. First is uncertainty propagation. So you want to avoid propagating uncertainty from your data to your model to your control policy. Can you sidestep that and go directly for the policy? The other one often brought up in system modification is to avoid the bias error. So now this is in state feedback, but in input-output setting, the hardest part about SysID is actually what is called model order selection. So that you choose a model class. And then you get a bias error because inevitably you always choose the wrong class. And if you do a direct approach, you don't encounter that bias error. You might get better policies. So what people classically do, if I look at my colleagues in reinforcement learning, let's say let's estimate the gradient with zeroth order methods. Something as simple as let's use a finite difference approximation, probe the system left, probe it right, take the difference, divide it by 2, and there you go. Or, in higher dimensions, you would evaluate j of k plus a random direction u, sampled uniformly in, with some radius r, compared to different points, and then go in the direction u, so this would be a directional gradient, and in expectation, this would recover actually a true gradient. Anyway, that's sort of just a zeroth order optimization. This works well in expectation. The problem is following. You need to take many samples, because you cannot take an expectation, you have to average. But every time you want to evaluate j of k, what is j of k? It's the infinite horizon cost function, where you just need a long enough trajectory to somewhat decently evaluate that. Okay? So here's some of the sample complexity estimates. Say we have a fourth order system, just fourth order. We want to get within 1% of optimality. It turns out if you want to get there, you need in total like 100 trajectories, each of length 140,000. So it's somewhere 10 to the 7 trajectories to get to 1% optimality for a fourth order system. Which somewhat kills this idea for me. Why would you ever do black box gradient descent? Okay. So you can do it if you have a simulator and a lot of time, but it's not at all suited for any sort of adaptive control problem where you have to in real time interact with the system. You cannot do 10 to the 7 times probing before you take a step. That wouldn't fly. It's episodic and more or less it's useless, right? So this idea of doing model-free gradient descent, you cannot implement that. So that's where you call this sample covariance parameterization to rescue to see, can we actually compute the gradient with only a single interaction with the system? Can we also get the gradient estimate? So here's why I do this. Again, let me pull out this equation that parameterizes the problem. So I leave uncertainty aside from now. So there's no W. I'll bring it back in later. Let me just explain to you the deterministic case. So we have our 3 data matrices, x0 and x1, state and successor state, and the input time series. We know they're related by this red box here. Let me formulate the sort of the empirical sample covariances. So let me multiply data matrix times data matrix transpose divided by the length of the time series. This will be the state input covariance. I'll call this one lambda. Let me also form the covariance with the successor state. I call this one x1. Okay, so now we just have 2 covariances for both the state input and with the successor state. Since the covariance matrix, due to the persistent excitation example, is positive definite, I can use the covariance matrix to perform a clever coordinate transformation to go from policy space to another space. In particular, since this matrix here is positive definite, I can rewrite a vector that contains a matrix that contains k, the unknown policy and identity. formulate this into another variable v. I just use this coordinate transformation. Okay, yeah, you can do this, but why would you do this? Why would you care? So here's like one line of a little bit of linear algebra that maybe shows you why you care about this. What you're interested in if you want to solve any sort of linear optimal control problem with explicit feedback policies, you want to know A plus BK. Because A plus BK is the one thing that enters all of your LMIs or Riccati equations. If you know how to parameterize A plus BK, you're in shape. So can we parameterize A plus BK just by data? So the way we do this, we write A plus BK as BAKI. Now we pull out this green matrix. Okay, BKI is our covariance matrix times V. So that's going to new coordinates times V. Now notice that here B times A times the input and state time series, oh, that's the red box up here. That's the right-hand side of the red box. So I use the red box and say, oh, this is x1, my successor state time series, times my state input time series, which again I recognize as my successor covariance. And now I've written it in terms of the successor covariance, which are all like cheap linear algebra tricks. And you wonder why the hell would you do this? The takeaway is I can now take any sort of model-based control design formulation and replace the A plus BK in my LMIs by the expression above me. So I can take any of my favorite formulations and replace A plus BK by this successor covariance times V and the green equation here. I can do this for Kalman filtering when I have A plus LC, for H affinity sign, LQR, whatever. You can replace all of the LMIs if you want by that. In principle, at least, you still have to solve them. So there have been many people, exploring this covariance parameterization over many years, and most classic in stochastic realization theory, but also now more and more people look into this. It seems like a clever parameterization for these problems. So the idea for this covariance parameterization, I take my formulation of the problem, where I have the A plus BK, and replace A plus BK by this successor covariance and my reparameterization. And this is what it looks like. Okay, so now I have a problem that is formulated only in terms of data matrices. Okay, there's no more A and B. There's also no more K. I mean, I could explicitly eliminate K from these equations. It's not hard. And now I optimize over K, the covariance sigma, as well as this new variable V. Turns out this does not change the problem class. I can still easily convexify this with some parameter changes, and I can still go down the gradient. I still have the gradient dominance, and then all of this holds. It's just another parameterization of the problem. So it's really the same problem as before, now just written in V coordinates. It's not anymore in policy coordinates. And sigma and K can be explicitly eliminated. I just go down the gradient in V. It turns out, compared to the previous formulation, there's one thing you have now that you didn't have before, which is an equality constraint. Meaning you have to project the gradient on the equality constraint, but that's just multiplying everything by a matrix. You just project in the range space of that equality constraint. So now you just do gradient descent in that new space V, in the new variables. And the only thing you have to do extra is project on that linear reparameterization. So there's this pi, a projection matrix, which just takes care of this constraint. You don't have to remember all the details, all the formulas, just takeaways. You can parameterize the problem in terms of sample covariances and do gradient descent in that sample covariance space. And I can easily evaluate that, right? I just have my sample covariance from my data, and I could now evaluate, solve this sort of Lyapunov equation in that new space, compute the gradient, actuate, repeat. And now taking the same fourth order system as before, I can actually now solve this in the deterministic case, so no noise, to global optimality with 6 samples. Not 10 to the 7, 6, right? Which is, I guess, a big change, right? So you go from 10 to the 7 times sampling a system to 6 times. Much, much cheaper. As none of this is adaptive, it's not online, I just take the data once offline, but that's enough to compute the gradient descent range, which makes suddenly this gradient descent in a direct way very attractive, right? You don't have to probe the system with zero Wilson mass to get the gradient. You just use the different parameterization and directly get a gradient out of it, which makes it useful. Good. Are there any questions so far? Yes, please.
Initially, you explained you displayed several things in a Venn diagram, direct and indirect. And also, sorry, I don't quite remember, but it was in the slides. I was wondering if some of them might be gradients. For example, from my understanding, direct would be a human figuring out an algorithm to implement.
Yep.
While the indirect is the machine having to adapt itself to reality. And for example, that could be a gradient of human in the loop, so it might not be yes or wrong, but there's different scenarios where one is more fitting, as well as soft and hard logic. And also the time context windows, like offline and online, that's a yes or a no. But perhaps you could look at it as sometimes we need longer context, sometimes we need shorter context. So I was just wondering to hear your opinion about these as gradients.
Sure. So the goal I'm after would be now, maybe to answer the last question first, would be I would like to update my policy every time I do it. And there's many paths I can do it, through models or through covariance matrices. Yeah. But you could argue, is that the best thing? Should you update all the time?
Yeah.
Or should you have some sort of information criterion, such as when variance is high, then you update your policy? I don't have the answer. It turns out empirically, it's not best to always update every time, but to wait until you collected enough information.
Yeah, it seems
in some sort of event-triggered fashion.
That's a problem of like how adaptive do you need to be?
Yeah.
And if you could get AI to decide when to be more adaptive, with more entropy and more chaotic, we kind of give up. We say, okay, it's really chaotic, this problem, we want to be very adaptive. Or if the AI can identify this as a direct solution, that it can do some transformation to linear space, get an accurate prediction, and we can ensure stability.
Yeah.
So there's kind of this meta problem of how adaptive do we need to be?
Yes, I fully agree. I do not have an answer for that, but we also recognize this, you can adapt every time, but is this the best thing to do? It turns out in adaptive control, people worked out the solutions of adapting continuously, more historically because adaptive control came out of nonlinear control. But also people have worked it out in sort of an event-triggered fashion, like you adapt only if state exceeds a bound, or only if variance exceeds a bound, or these type of things. I've not seen any statement about what's the optimal adaptation rate. But that's definitely a very important question to ask. Yes. How often should you adapt? But I've seen many results, but nobody said this is the rate at which you should adapt it.
Interesting.
Yeah. Maybe here first, from left to right.
Do we need any assumption level on the XNU data? So for the data, you're using the covariance information. Do we need to assume that those XNU data is coming from the exact K or can that become?
Yes. So normally if you do adaptive control, the big question is persistive excitation, which means plainly, is this matrix invertible? Is it positive definite? Here I take a big sidestep in terms of I assume it. I could, of course, try to satisfy it by always injecting noise in the problem, persistently exciting, and I have always full rank, and I can always invert it. How do you solve it if you do not want to inject noise? Which, again, in reinforcement learning, people do not inject noise. They would say, let's explore, let's go in the direction of maximum variance. Here, just make an assumption. It is invertible, it has full rank. But how you assure that is separate. Yeah.
As long as you have the full rank in the covariance metric, then you can always apply this too.
Yes, correct. But full rank is a necessary condition for almost everything you want to do. Yeah. Ali?
This reminds me of it, and maybe I got the timing of the result wrong, but can you comment on how this relates to the work of Persis and Tesi?
Yes, absolutely. It actually is fully derived from them, so I skipped that, but it would have been here at the bottom of the slide.
Oh, okay.
So the Persis and Tesi, they work with just the data matrices. They did not take the covariance. The problem with working with data matrices is they grow over time. They become longer and longer and longer. So it's not like the right data format that you want to use. Whereas the covariance matrix always stays square. And you can do cheap rank 1 updates and so on. But in principle, it's the very same tricks, just
And
applied.
they still get a convex optimization
Yes,
policy.
correct, yes. But it's very much just taking their formulation and writing it in this covariance space. Yes. Jean-Jacques?
In the case star, is the unique minimum of your cost function? Or not?
Yes, in this case, there would be a unique minimum for the LQR problem. It turns out when you go to other problem formulations like LQG or H infinity, this unique minimum would not exist anymore.
And you say this works only if it's persistent, so they say they show.
Yes, people showed a necessary condition for solving the LQR problem is persistive excitation.
And in that case, you have to go through the whole thing.
What was the question?
In that case, you have a stability proof of the whole algorithm. So.
Yes, it will come later. So this is now a statement only about this algorithm converges, but I did not talk about what happens in closed loop. Yeah.
When we were talking about the Pascal results, and you mentioned the boundedness of the hashing, I think globally, I think it will conflict with coercive in this condition because if you have a finite boundary, the hashing needs to explode to remain coercive, right? Mm-hmm. I understand it doesn't matter because within the level sets,
sure,
the hashing is bounded, and then you also vary variance. But
correct.
Because I also have in an adaptive scenario, that boundary moves, and if my approach and put you within a place where you have a fixed spread gradient,
yes,
you are not unstable.
Yes, fully agree. 2 comments. Formally speaking, everything depends on the initial condition, like the bound on the derivative depends on the initial condition. And this is all just for LTI, which is the cheap solution. Where you would have an LTV problem, further complications come in, like this boundary is moving. And so.
Do you think this could be something as simple as a variance step size gradient descent, or more complicated than that? So if I take my step size to be the hashing of the point that I'm evaluating at every point from a theoretical point of view.
Mm-hmm. It turns out that's what you have to do, at least in the LTI case. You have to adapt your step size to the curvature of the cost function. And if it's time varying, if you have some a priori uniform bounds on how curved it is, you could do this, yeah. Yes?
Yeah, similar question to what kind of adaptivity we need.
Mm-hmm.
So in some sense, if we are convinced that the offline version of the algorithm, in our case, first identify a system and then do LQR control stuff is optimal given a certain data set.
Mm-hmm.
The optimal or the ideal perfect adaptive algorithm would be I run this offline version every time I get new data, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's infeasible because some practical reason says computation is too expensive to do it every time and it's not feasible. So I have to find an approximation of this version with more adaptive version that I can actually run at each control loop time. So do you have a comparison between this method, the method they are presenting, and the ideal case where I pretend that I can solve the offline version at each step?
So 3 comments. I'll have some plots on it later, but maybe 3 comments. One is solving a least square problem and solving the LQR problem at any point in time is actually rate optimal in terms of regret. I guess Max Simkovich proved that. So it is optimal. However, in practice, it doesn't work. Reason being, if your data is noisy, the minimizer of some noisy cost function goes around. So every time you get a different minimizer, whereas the gradient direction doesn't care much about the noise. It's much less sensitive. So with noisy data, you just go downhill. But if I jump directly to the minimizer, it jumps around, right? And then you get like quite zigzaggy curves. So long story short, the gradient is a more robust direction. Just like in other control problems, say you want to go down a Lyapunov function, you don't jump to the minimum. You just say go down minus G transpose gradient V or something like that, right? Because that descent direction is a robust one. It's insensitive to uncertainty or noise or whatsoever. So while theoretically it's optimal to solve the problem at any point in time, in practice it doesn't work quite well. Yes?
How is behavior when you have noise in the stochastic system, then you don't have like a substitute?
Yes, I will comment on that later, but if you had now noise in the problem, all of these equations would break apart because this unknown additive noise would destroy all these nice subspace relations. The way we'll deal with that, we sort of robustify ourselves to noise a posteriori. Yeah. Yes?
Going back to assumptions and sort of initial results we showed on the policy gradient, there was a requirement for an initial stabilizing control and a requirement that the learning rate data was small. So I guess the first question is, how small is small for the learning rate? And the second question is, do those assumptions apply also to the sample covariance?
Sure. Yes, you need an initial stabilizing policy. Actually, most of these algorithms would need an initial stabilizing policy. I think there's a few, like value function iteration, we could start anywhere, but most of them would need that. How big is the steps allowed to be? It's just the standard rule from the gradient descent is you don't want to jump on the other side of the minimum. So it depends on the Hessian matrix, on the Lipschitz constant of the gradient. So that's, yeah. Okay, so we can also do gradient descent in these new covariance coordinates, and we get away essentially without doing it, knowing the model for that. Just some statements on that. So fact 1, you can do this policy descent in the covariance coordinates And if you translate the algorithm back into model-based coordinates, just for, let me say, intuition, it turns out you get, again, some sort of pre-scaled gradient, where the gradient would now be pre-scaled by some data matrices as well as a projection or parameterization constraint. But that's more for intuition. Essentially, it's a scaled version of gradient descent if you do it in this covariance coordinates. Second fact, which I guess in theory is well known, but it would take quite some time to prove it, is if you do the natural gradient descent, this is coordinate invariant. That is, if you do natural gradient descent, so you do gradient descent pre-multiplied by sort of inverse variance, then you get the same natural gradient descent as in the model-based coordinates. So it's invariant with that. Long story short, why are these two effects interesting? Because you just recycle all the proofs from the model-based case and apply them one-to-one here. So it's a big shortcut for proving things.
Translate that coordinate transformation into English. What does it do then?
What does it do? So it turns out if I would just take my gradient descent in these coordinates, and I translate this just with this green box into the k coordinates, this is what it looks like. Meaning you don't just go down the gradient, but the gradient is pre-multiplied by some scaling matrix that depends on data. If instead I would do here what is called natural gradient descent, that is I pre-multiply the gradient by the inverse covariance, I get the same gradient descent as in k coordinates. Things don't change. So you don't get this pre-scaling. And again, we use this mostly as a crux that we don't have to write the proofs again, so we can use the old proofs and apply them here. And you get all the desired properties, of course. Now, I want to go back to your question here. You said, what do you do with noise? So when you have noise in the problem, these nice covariance coordinates look different. So if we were to repeat all these tricks here that I showed you, that is, how do I go from the a plus bk into a new formulation that just depends on covariance coordinates, and now there would be a noise here, like plus w, that you don't know. But it turns out your a plus bk is not the successor covariance times v. It will be something different. It will be, so when you have your noise, it will be the successor covariance minus some matrix that depends on noise times v. Where this matrix is sort of your dirt effect, it's the covariance between noise state input, which you don't know. Right? So you don't know. Now, the problem you should really be solving is the one that is in red here, right? But you don't know the disturbance, right? So that's a little bit idealized. One thing we learned from the data-driven control literature over the last 6-7 years is that when you solve the idealized problem and then you want to apply it to the noisy problem, a very simple trick that works quite well is just do the regularization. So don't solve the original problem, but cleverly regularize it. So what regularization should we pick here? So what you can do, you can work out the Lyapunov equation that gives you the stability equation in case you were to know the noise. So the Lyapunov equation that would include the red term. You could work it out what it looks like. But of course, you don't know the noise. You compare this to the original Lyapunov equation that you're actually solving. And you see the two Lyapunov equations are differing by a term that is depending on your covariances, on the new policy variable v, on the state covariance sigma, as well as the empirical covariance lambda. And one way now to, when you solve the idealized Lyapunov equation, but you also make sure the noisy one is true, is just say, let's minimize the difference. So it's a very naive idea in that regard. So let's just regularize the LQR problem. And as a regularization term, we throw on top of it the difference between the noisy and the idealized Lyapunov equation, making sure that if you solve one of them, you also solve the other, that you also have stability in presence of noise. And these are again some tricks that people have already explored in like some data-driven control context, in deep C or by Claudio De Persis and others, that this is a good regularization term. You can also write in the model-based setting, then this is what it looks like. Maybe not so interesting. What is maybe the main takeaway is the optimization class has not changed. You're still within the same optimization class. You just add like one more term to your objective function, but it does not destroy any sort of the gradient dominance properties, and everything still goes through. Instead of minimizing the LQR cost, you could minimize this regularized cost. Let me show you the effect of that. So I put in front of the regularization term this lambda, and here's the plot that shows when you change lambda what happens. So if lambda is 0 and you don't regularize, I think this is like for a fourth order system, 1,000 realizations, it turns out only 90% of the solutions you get will actually be stable. because your data was corrupted by noise, and about 10% of the cases, if you solve the problem by noise-corrupted data, you get an unstable solution. Whereas you regularize it with this extra term, suddenly you go up to 100% of solutions being stabilizing. And you don't need much, like 10 to the minus 2. So that was expected. What we didn't expect was a nice takeaway that also your relative performance gap would improve. That is, if you start regularizing, you get typically better solutions, which was, I guess, unexpected, but we take it. Turns out it also improves the algorithmic convergence. Maybe not so surprising, you add an extra strongly convex term to your cost function, your iterates are more nicely behaved, maybe that's expected. Okay, so if you compare the curves, one are with and one are without regularization, some are much smoother. Now, should you always regularize? Should you always make sure you solve that problem? It turns out, yeah, you need to decrease the constant from the regularizer, but maybe that's not so. So last main topic, and Julie, what are we doing? What happens in closed loop? Okay, so it's not obvious that this would actually work in closed loop, going down the gradient, any of these gradients. Reason being, every time you get a stabilizing policy, but every time you have a different policy, meaning every time you have a different closed loop matrix. So if you have a switch system, and you know the famous joint spectral radius problem, the product of a whole bunch of stable matrices is not stable. That's a problem that in reinforcement learning they call sequential stability. What's the takeaway? So here's the result you get in closed loop. Let me skip that. So one thing I have to introduce is that there's a signal to noise ratio you have to introduce. In the noisy case, your signal part is the lowest single value of the covariance matrix, and your noise part is the upper bound of the covariance on the noise. So here's the result you get what happens in closed loop when you analyze stability. Let me unpack it. There's a few assumptions. One is you need an initially stabilizing policy. The other one is you need a sufficiently large signal-to-noise ratio, and you need a sufficiently small step size, which maybe is not surprising from adaptive control because it's well known when you adapt too fast, bad things happen. So you need to choose sufficiently small step size so that it works. And in this case, you get actually nice convergence. That is both your state will have an exponential convergence plus a bias due to noise, as well as your policy has an exponential convergence plus a bias due to noise. Okay, things work also in closed loop. In the tool we leverage, there's what is called sequential stability, which boils down to asking, along your sequence of matrices, they shouldn't change too much from one step to the other. That's why you need a small enough step size. And we've also been applying this type of analysis to other reinforcement learning algorithms. Again, if you don't impose a bound on the rate of change, when you do it in closed loop, they go unstable. So it turns out that's a necessary condition. So let me skip those comments on the result. Maybe look some closed loop properties, which go back to one of your questions. So here's what is a benchmark example by Sarah Dean and Nick Mutney. And I compare different algorithms. If you just solve the one-shot problem, there's any point in time you solve LQR and least squares and apply it, yeah, it might work, but you get horrible transient, lots of oscillations, because the optimizer is very sensitive to noise. Whereas any of the gradient descent methods would actually nicely converge. Likewise, when you look at different data sets, so quality data versus noisy data, a gradient descent would always nicely converge. It turns out the one-shot method gives you quite high variance, and also what is called the Gauss-Newton, so the Hewes algorithm, the iterative policy evaluation improvement, would actually also give you a lot of oscillations. The reason being it doesn't have a step size, you cannot make it small enough, at least not the vanilla algorithm. And that's why you get a lot of oscillations. So you cannot make the step size small, which I guess shows you have to adapt sufficiently slow. Last, to conclude, maybe I'll show you one implementation we work on. We looked into different ones, but here's the one I care most about, power systems. So what you see is a very complicated block diagram of a wind turbine connected to the power grid, the power electronics, the turbine, the grid. It turns out we can leave that all aside because the person that has to implement the controls of the wind turbine does not have a model of the power system, a dynamic model, and does not have a model from the vendor of the wind turbine. So in practice, you tune these outer, what are called power loops of the power converters, essentially as a PI with, tune it until it works. Because model-based design just exists in papers. You cannot do it in reality because you just don't have the models. The data is siloed between different companies. They will not share it. So let's apply the gradient descent here. A challenge is, of course, this model, you don't have the state, but you can easily construct a state realization. Non-minimal realization, that is, you just take your inputs and outputs and the time shifts, and from that you build your state space realization. I guess it's what you learn in class as controllable canonical form, just the time shifts. You apply the gradient descent here. So you see some oscillations from your wind turbine to the grid. You collect data, so you probe the system a little with additive noise to get the persistive excitation. And you see this would nicely converge. Whereas if you do with no control, you get persistence oscillations. What happens when you have a fault? So everything is stable, everything is nice. You change a parameter in the system. In this case, the DC controlled power set point would change, if you know what that is. Nothing happens, everything is stable. I mean, you're at steady state, everything is nice. But then you get a fault, and the control you have was tuned for the wrong model. But when you start adapting, this would actually nicely converge compared to the control that is non-adapted. So I guess you see the benefits of adaptive control. Which brings to the end. So summary, I talked about this gap, I think mostly a cultural gap between reinforcement learning and adaptive control. And I launched maybe another N+1 attempt to bridge it, which many people have done before. It was a very naive idea, just go down the policy gradient in real time, see if that works. And you saw you can get the closed loop stability if you choose a small enough step size, which is important. For future work, I guess from all the obvious ones, like improve the assumptions, is I'd like to go beyond noise injection. Like a persistive excitation by putting in noise, I think, is a very naive idea. Can you do better? Can you do something more clever than putting in noise? And there's also the question asked by you, namely, but what's the best batch size? When should you adapt? Should you adapt every point in time? Or is there some sort of information criterion that tells you when you should adapt or not? And I don't have answers to these, but we're looking at those. Thank you very much.